Welcome, everyone, to our first session of Cutting Through the Noise. This is an opportunity for the Anshe Emet family and the larger community to hear from people who bring firsthand knowledge and a depth of understanding to the issues that we face. In order to cut through the noise, all of us, and that's the goal here, all of us are inundated with information from cable news to podcast to TikTok to X to email feeds. It's overwhelming at times. So tonight we're here to listen, to learn, and to deepen our understanding of this challenging moment. And it's our honor to welcome Jacob Magid to this opportunity to listen and to talk. So thanks for joining us, Jacob.
Thanks for having me, Rabbi Siegel.
A little bit about Jacob. He attended the University of Maryland. Little known fact about Jacob is that he served as a basketball official, where Jacob says he learned to deal with conflict management and temperamental personalities. So that has held you in good stead. Um, he's been at the Times of Israel for 6 years and presently serves as the U.S. Bureau Chief and since August of 2020. And there, Jacob leads TOL's Times of Israel's coverage of developments in the United States as they relate to Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world. And over the years, he has established sources in the White House, the State Department across two administrations, and with diplomats at embassies, including ones that don't have formal ties with Israel. Like many on this Zoom call, Jacob, we appreciate your reporting. We appreciate the work that you do and your weekly analysis on the Times of Israel's daily briefing podcast, which I listened to this morning. And we thank you for all you do. And it's a pleasure to welcome you. And in the words of Hamilton, you are a person who has been very much in the room where it happens and reports on it. So just to start, what has it been like for you since October 7th as a reporter in the midst of all of the maelstrom?
Yeah, so again, thank you very much for having me. I'm trying to remember where I wrote some of that bio information, but that was good digging. Maybe it's my LinkedIn. Might need to be updated a little bit. But I would definitely say the past 22 months have been a whirlwind. I would probably agree that my job was a bit chaotic and busy beforehand. Um, I covered the last year of the Trump administration, which is the Abraham Accords were happening. So that was a pretty wild time. There's maybe, you could argue, somewhat of a calm for the beginning of the Biden administration. But once you had this judicial reform, judicial overhaul taking place in Israel, there was a lot of intervention and involvement that led my job to pick up during that year, that first year of, I guess, the Prime Minister Netanyahu's government. That kept things quite busy, but that from October 7th onward, I mean, at that point, I hadn't been on vacation for a year. I was finally on vacation on October 7th, and that's when that happened, and cut that short, and have been kind of working quite nonstop since. We're trying to find a new equilibrium where, like, I'm accepting there's a degree of busyness that's always going to be there, while also feeling constantly drawn, even when I'm on breaks, to want to continue either A, having a pulse on what's happening because things are moving so quickly, but B, feeling a kind of a responsibility to keep the public informed during this very troubling time. I think one of the few respites I think one can get from this 22-month period is that I think maybe by having more information and feeling a better understanding of what's happening, can maybe be a little bit less overwhelming and unsettling. So I think that's what we try to do at Times of Israel, is try to supply as much information as possible. And it's definitely a taxing job, but very rewarding. I think it's a way to maybe contribute as a part of the Jewish people, to be able to, if I'm not either serving or on the ground in other ways, but this is I think a way that keeps me grounded. So it's been a wild period, but meaningful.
Well, I can tell you, and I think I speak on behalf of everyone on this call, it's vital work, Jacob, and you do a very, very fine job of it. I think you probably have a deeper understanding of that Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times, than most of us. I'm looking at the articles with your name in the byline published in the last 10 days at the Times of Israel. No more partial deals, official says Israel, US now back comprehensive peace plan to end the war. Losing Republicans by the day, support for Israel slipping among Trump's base. Don't think Trump, don't think Gaza war is genocide. Some horrible things happened on October 7th. On the precipice of defeat, 19 former defense chiefs demand end to Gaza war. J Street head says he's convinced Gaza war is genocide. Netanyahu's son calls Qatari leader modern day Hitler. Almost 9 in 10 aid trucks looted before reaching Gaza destinations, UN figures show. Bucking IDF warning, security cabinet approves Netanyahu's plan to conquer Gaza City. In major shift, Germany suspends arms exports to Israel over Gaza City takeover plan. It is dizzying just this is in the last 10 days. So as you said at the onset, you reported during the Biden administration and during the Trump administration, the end of the first Trump administration, now very much in the second Trump administration. Can you talk for a moment about your understanding of their respective approaches to Israel?
Sure. And it'd be interesting to just thinking about the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. But I think on the trying to compare Biden to Trump, there's like a inherent pro-Israel leaning. I think that's there for both of them. But I think in the case of President Biden, there was more of a willingness to challenge the Israeli government's thinking when you're thinking specifically about the war in Gaza, and the humanitarian file specifically. If you think about that was something from the get-go that the Biden administration put at the top of its priorities, even conditioning President Biden's trip to that first trip, I think it was around 7 or 11 days after October 7th, his arrival at Ben Gurion Airport was held up until Israel was able to commit to allowing humanitarian aid into Gaza. And what we saw in the Trump administration was a decision to basically allow Israel for a 78-day period to test this theory that if you withhold humanitarian aid, it will lead Hamas to capitulate in negotiations, and allowed Israel to simply not have any aid go into Gaza for almost 3 months. Now there's been a shift once we started seeing some of the photos that were coming out of Gaza, and President Trump also expressed his dissatisfaction with that, but it still wasn't willing to publicly criticize Israel as overtly as I think some in the Biden administration did during his term. And I think there's also a general willingness to kind of let things play out when it comes to the Gaza war, but also in terms of how Israel wants to see the future after Gaza. Whereas the Biden administration, I think, had a very specific vision in mind. It wasn't necessarily willing to push Israel very far in this issue because it was never actualized, but it envisioned this two-state dynamic, at least having a framework set to eventually get there. And it spent a lot of times putting conditions about what it wanted to see for how Gaza would look like after the war. Whereas the Trump administration, I think, is not beyond what we had, I think, at this brief period in February where President Trump talks about his plan to take over Gaza and turn it into a Riviera. They've stepped back from that since, and are kind of not really talking so much about the day after and letting Israel be the one to dictate those terms. So I guess part of the broader Trump outlook in the world, which if you read his speech when he went to the Gulf a few months ago, where he basically says, we don't want to get involved in how the countries here run these things. It's up to you. We're not going to try to dictate terms. And I think that's how he sees the world more broadly, you could argue. Whereas the Biden administration, I think, had some more conditions about what it wants to see in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the region more broadly.
The other day, you made a comment on a podcast where you quoted a career diplomat in Israel saying that with all of the challenges that Israel had with the Biden administration, they also served as a guardrail. And he used the humanitarian issues as a case in point. Well, say more about that. And how did you read that? How did you understand that?
You're really listening to this podcast. So I would stress that this was definitely not like a political appointee. As you mentioned, it was a career diplomat, and someone who, if you were listening, probably maybe wouldn't be voting for Netanyahu in the next election. So that I think it is to be taken with a grain of salt, but I just think there is a recognition, at least now, even Netanyahu in his press conference on press conferences plural on Sunday, there was a recognition that the humanitarian issue has not been managed very well. And he gives different reasons for why that is, that maybe critics of Israel would say has more to do with how Israel's handled it. But I think there is a recognition that withholding aid for 78 days was a mistake, and B, this GHF trial has not gone as well as either GHF or some others are trying to frame it as. This Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which is the American and a new Israeli-backed organization that was founded in I guess you could say earlier in the spring. It started operations in May. The idea was to try to box Hamas out of the process of aid. The feeling that in Israel is that Hamas has been taking control of a lot of it, either directly or indirectly. And what Netanyahu recognizes in this press conference on Sunday is that maybe we should have had additional distribution sites. That was one critique that he felt was what he was willing to cede. And there were others that he talks about that maybe Hamas was also involved in stealing some of GHF aid. I think GHF would probably dispute that, but there is a willingness on Netanyahu's part to say that it didn't go well. And I think some of the mistakes that were made, had there been a more active US involvement, like there was during the Biden administration, I think we might have seen maybe a slightly different result. There were various periods during the Biden administration as well that the humanitarian situation got pretty dire. But it was interesting to hear, at least from this diplomat who serving in a pretty prominent position, I will say, made this point that it would be helpful at times to have a more engaged US with Steve Witkoff, who he was proven successful, I think, in January and helping broker the first hostage, or I guess second hostage deal that we saw. But he's not a humanitarian expert, and yet he's being kind of tasked with this issue. He has very few staff members with him, kind of works on his own, and he's also trying to deal with 3 or 4 other conflicts at the same time. And when you're stretched so thin, I think it's hard to argue that those are the right parameters to be able to successfully do your job. And I think maybe the current humanitarian situation is there's also a US role in that to the point where we gotten.
Well, let's just stay with this press conference for a minute last
Sure.
night. Obviously very relevant. It was unusual because the prime minister gave 2 press conferences, one to English press and then to the Israeli press. I know you watched both of them. Tell us your impressions. Here you're a press person watching a press conference, so give us some of your insights and also give us some insight into how you think the prime minister did, because I think he got some hard questions along the way.
Yeah, I think the goal of the English press conference was broadly to dispel two issues. One about this notion that Israel might be occupying all of Gaza or trying to occupy all of Gaza. What Netanyahu tried to argue is that that's not the goal. But the reason why I think many people assumed it was is that Netanyahu and his aides for the past couple of weeks, that was their initial plan. And I think they had to be talked down from it, partially by the IDF, that was really concerned that this would lead to a disaster for the hostages. It would lead to the IDF being put in responsibility for either basically all of Gaza's population, if not just those roughly 1 million people in Gaza City.
And that,
Because,
that would have an impact on their legal responsibilities as
right,
well.
right. So basically, the argument that Israel's made until now is that it is not legally responsible for providing services to Gaza's population, that all it has to do is facilitate humanitarian aid because it doesn't have effective control over Gaza and cannot effectively govern. But if you that now, after taking over 75% of the territory and then extending that 75 to, I don't know, 90% with Gaza City, it's harder to argue that you don't have the capacity or the ability or effective control over the entire Gaza Strip. And then therefore you no longer have the ability to just say this is the UN's problem to get aid to these 2 million people and other services as well, but it's actually Israel's problem. And that was one of the arguments I think that the IDF successfully made and the security establishment more broadly made to talk Netanyahu down from this broader Gaza occupation plan. But when there's talk of Gaza City takeover, occupation, Gaza City, Gaza, I think there's a lot of confusion and led maybe some to continue to believe that the plan is to occupy all of Gaza. So I think part of the English press conference was focused on walking back some of those initial assumptions. And the other goal, I think, was to really hammer down against this claim that Israel is trying to starve the Gazan population. While, as I mentioned, recognizing some issues that had been coming out with the rollout of GHF, what he tried to do is argue that, look, if we wanted to starve the population, they would have been starved by now. If we wanted to commit genocide, we would have done it in 48 hours. I think something of those words were used. And he pointed to various pictures that came out in international press that tried to depict the starvation in Gaza, or the alleged starvation in Gaza, and basically showed in the three of the examples that were used in the press were actually children who were suffering from other pre-existing conditions that didn't have to do with the malnutrition aspect. And that is why they were seen to be incredibly malnourished in these photos, and that this was a form of blood libel that was used against Israel to try to argue that, or to try to claim that it was has a policy of starvation in Gaza. And Netanyahu tried to use the press conferences to kind of dispel that as well. So I think those were the two main things that he was focused on in the English press conference. What I will say on the latter issue of the aid is that he tried to argue that while, yes, we stopped the aid from the UN existing mechanisms on March 2nd, at the same time, simultaneously, he used the word simultaneously, we resumed aid, or we started doing aid through the GHF system. But that's not what I've spoken a little and written a little bit about, is that it's not so accurate, that the aid through GHF didn't start coming in until well after the aid from the UN stopped. GHF didn't start operating until May 26th, and slowly, gradually expanded its operations. It's now operating 3 sites and talks about over, I think, 115 million meals that it's distributed. Those numbers, I think we can talk a little bit about. It's a little bit less black and white than that, but basically there's making the argument, I think Netanyahu was trying to do, is that yes, there might have been hiccups, but this wasn't an intentional effort to try to starve Gazans.
What was the difference between the English and the Hebrew? What was
So the
was there more
Hebrew
focus on?
press conference. Sorry, I lost. Okay, so the Hebrew press conference, can you hear me, Rabbi Siegel? Okay, sorry, there's a little bit of a delay. The Hebrew
Let me
press
interrupt you for 1 second.
conference.
Just for the listeners, if you have questions, there's a question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. So if you want to put questions in, we'll get to as many as we can. Go ahead.
Sure. So the Hebrew press conference, I think, also tried to lay out the plan that the Israeli cabinet approved in this 10-hour meeting on Thursday night, Friday morning last week. But what was more interesting was the focus in the questions. I think the real issue for a lot of the Israeli public is the issue of the reservists and how, I guess, tired many of them are. Many of them are serving over 200, 300 days and being told to continuously come back and report for duty when there's this feeling that there's a major sector of the population that is not serving. That's the ultra-Orthodox, where we're talking about tens of thousands of eligible youth that could really help ease the burden on some of these other Israelis who are serving more. And that not only are they not serving, but the government is currently working to pass legislation that will grant pretty blanket exemptions to allow our Haredi yeshiva students to continue not serving in the army. Now, Netanyahu didn't bring this up on his own, but that's what a lot of the questions were about, and including quotes recently made by various ministers, Aryeh Deri, the Shas leader of the ultra-Orthodox Shas parties, who was quoted just a few days ago saying that God forbid anyone even in the Haredi world even considers or thinks about joining the army instead of studying in yeshiva. That was a quote that was taken not too well, I think, from pretty broad swaths of the Israeli public. And Netanyahu was pushed on that as well. So I think what Netanyahu tried to do is argue that, look, this legislation is actually going to be leading to several thousand, up to 10,000, I think he says, Haredim drafting into the army. I think there are critics of this legislation that would frame it differently. But basically insisting that what he's directed the IDF to do is try to implement this takeover of Gaza City as quickly as possible because he recognizes the strain on the reserve forces. So I think that was something that he really tried to emphasize. What he was also pushed, I think, in the more interesting question and answer, because the Israeli press is, I think, a little bit more equipped to press him on these issues, was about this notion that this is the last stronghold that we need to take out, and then the war will be over. Just if we finish Gaza City, then we'll get the total victory that he's been pledging since, I think, about a year and a half ago, if not longer. But if you go back, if you looked at the press conferences he's held before, one before Gideon's Chariots, the operation he launched in March, but more prominently, the several press conferences and media appearances that he held ahead of the operation in Rafah in 2024, which was also framed as this is the last place we need to go to once we eliminate or dismantle Hamas's remaining battalions in Rafah, then we'll have our total victory. And Netanyahu was pressed on why do you keep saying this is the last one when we keep having more and more operations? And his response was, look, after the Rafah operation, what's happened is we had these major successes in Lebanon against Hezbollah, in Syria, the collapse of Hezbollah led to the collapse of Syria that allowed for our victory in the 12-day war against Iran. And those victories wouldn't have been able to happen, I guess it was Netanyahu was trying to argue, had we not continued the fighting in Gaza, even though, yes, we haven't finished it off. And I think what it exposed is the criticism of this operation is that Hamas, after, you could argue as a result in some ways of the Rafah operation, is no longer operating as a full military infrastructure. It's kind of fallen apart to the point where it's more of a guerrilla warfare style of fighting. And it's an insurgency similar to what we've seen in other regions of the world that aren't simply demolished, A, without a viable alternative that's put in place, but B, just through the same style of warfare that Israel's been trying to use. because what has been happening is that each time Israel is trying to evacuate the civilian population, a lot of the Hamas operatives and fighters are simply evacuating with the civilians. And while some do stay back in Gaza City, and we're likely to see that play out in Gaza City, where there will be fighting, much of it will be much of the operations in Gaza City will be what we've seen in Gideon's Chariots, where there's a lot of booby trap buildings that Hamas operatives leave behind, and then they're evacuating. So even if, yes, Gaza City falls, not only it's not all of the operatives that are there that are falling with it, but they're just simply going to be moving with them to either the central camps and the Mawasi area, a little bit further south. And then Israel is going to, I guess Netanyahu will have to hold another press conference to say that this is the final bastion that will now have to take out in order to defeat Hamas. I'm not saying that these issues are simple by any means, but these are some of the criticisms that I think you're hearing, and maybe part of the reason why the majority of the public, if you believe some of the polling, Netanyahu will argue that the polling is not being fair, but are not supportive of extending this war in the way that Netanyahu wants to do it.
And there's a concern about the hostages and the fate of the hostages since it's believed that many of them are being held in that area, maybe not in the same place, but in that same area. And we saw something at the rally on Saturday night, I don't think that we've seen before, where people were saying from the rostrum that soldiers should disobey orders to go into Gaza City. That I think that's something new. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that's a very chilling moment, at least from my perspective.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. I think you might have heard it on the margins, but not maybe at the mainstream or the main rallies at Hostage Square. Yeah, I think that's going to be an issue that the IDF is going to have to deal with more and more. And it's one of the main reasons that I kind of neglected to mention of why they've been so opposed in the security establishment to this new operation is the feeling that we're really risking the lives of the hostages by proceeding into areas where they're being held, because we have past experience. Even when we think we know exactly where they are, we don't. In the case of those 6 hostages that were executed last summer, Hersh Goldberg Poland among them, when IDF soldiers were, I guess, identified by Hamas captors to be in the near vicinity. There was discussion, my understanding, speaking to one of the Israeli ministers, that there's talk about maybe just only operating above ground and not going below ground in order to not harm the hostages. But I mean, if that's the strategy, simply, I think we're going into dangerous territory. Netanyahu did talk about during the press conference that where we have creative ideas of how to go about trying to keep the hostages safe, but that he doesn't want to elaborate them publicly, which totally does make sense. But he simply has gotten to the conclusion that these negotiations, especially for this partial deal that that Israel have been pushing for so long, they're not going anywhere, and that the only way to release hostages is through defeating Hamas. And Netanyahu is of the belief that these two goals can be achieved in parallel, winning against Hamas and releasing the hostages. But logically, they kind of are seen to contradict, I think a lot of people would leave to understand. And that is why I think the Israeli public, feeling that either some will argue it's because they just simply don't trust this government in order to defeat Hamas, and others simply think that this is a prioritization that we want to make that we've defeated Hamas or struck a strong enough of a blow to Hamas to at this point pause and try to get the hostages out. And if we need to, Hamas will inevitably break a ceasefire and we'll be able to resume fighting or carry out similar strikes that we're doing against Hezbollah in Lebanon, even though there is a ceasefire there. These are very difficult questions, but I think it is noteworthy that the public is not where the government is on this issue.
It certainly doesn't feel that way. I want to acknowledge that some of the questions that we're getting are about Israel's ability to put out its message and have its message understood. You're a person, obviously, who pays very careful attention to presentation. Um, we live in a world where the word Hamas is barely mentioned in most articles, and the revulsion that is expressed towards Israel is rarely expressed towards Hamas, even though October 7th is October 7th, even though you have the Hamas charter. How do you explain this? What's wrong with the presentation of the public relations efforts on Israel's part? Is it just simply that people don't want to hear it?
Yeah, I think I was more hesitant to play the anti-Semitism card before October 7th. Um, but seeing the quick rallying around the Palestinian cause, and dismissal of what happened on October 7th so quickly afterwards, that I think it caused me to rethink a little bit about those who, um, or just the motivations of those criticizing Israel. And I think that is part of what's motivating some of these critics. Um, and that's a very difficult phenomenon to try to deal with, and I'm not an expert in trying to do so. I do think, though, that we're now no longer October 8th, 2023. As much as I do think, yes, the international community has moved on from October 7th, but part of that is because we're 22 months into a war that's taken the lives of 60,000 on the Palestinian side. And yes, that's the Hamas Foreign Health Ministry. Yes, those numbers don't differentiate between civilians and combatants, but those are very, very large numbers. And it's an ongoing phenomenon as opposed to October 7th, which is, yes, there's the hostage crisis that is continuing. But those numbers still pale in comparison to what's just the massive scale of the destruction in Gaza, that is ongoing. And I think oftentimes, yes, there is an issue that Israel could do a better job explaining itself. But I also think a lot of this has to do with policy, that it's not just an issue of Hasbara, PR. I do think it has to do with the policies that this government has been advancing. And particularly this notion of, I think it seems weedsy and wonky to talk about planning for the day after, but it's very hard to imagine how this really is able to end if in the way that Israel wants it to, without some sort of plan for the day after that's viable. And for most of the war, Israel refused to do that at all. And it was pretty widely understood because it would collapse the government if it did. Now, Netanyahu does argue that whatever alternative you put into Gaza, that would have collapsed if Hamas was still there. And that's a legitimate argument to make, but even for much of the war, he wasn't even trying to make that. Now he is, and I think he's arguing that once we defeat Hamas, we'll be able to put in the alternative that everyone seems to want. But I think what we're seeing is that that's not, to date, that has not been the case, that this war is dragged on because Hamas has continued to return to vacuums that Israel's briefly filling, creating in these military operations where they'll defeat Hamas, then clear the area, and Hamas is just simply returning to it. And Israel's, if you look at my colleague Manny Fabian, he's gone to Beit Hanun, I think 4 or 5 times for operations that were said to be is clearing the area, to defeat Hamas. But they just happen over and over again. We're in this cycle that I'm not an expert on the U.S. invasion of Iraq, but from what I speak to those who are experts, they do feel like there are a lot of similarities that led the U.S. to realize that it was making mistakes that now it seems like Israel's making in Gaza. And I'm getting into all this weeds because I think policy is a main part of how we got here. And I think we'll talk a little bit about the countries that are now deciding to recognize the Palestinian state. And I think a lot of it has to do with just feeling totally exhausted. It's not necessarily, doesn't seem like an effective policy decision, but I think it comes from a feeling of exasperation with dealing with this government and, well, we can't do anything else, so let's just do this.
But wouldn't you also
And I think
say, wouldn't you also say that, wouldn't you also say that these leaders, whether it's France or Canada, now Australia, and soon New Zealand, and on the list goes, and it's growing, the part of this is these leaders are responding to their own populations that are kind of watching this never-ending display of imagery and a presentation of a narrative that sees Israel in the worst possible light, and they are responding politically to their own population. And this is just another sign of Israel's or the failure of our public relations efforts in this area. I mean, that does have to count for something.
yes, I think what the Israeli government has argued that it's all domestic politics, that they're responding to their large number of Muslim immigrants to their countries in the UK and France. I don't know if that's a very winning argument to try to make at the political level, but yes, I think all politics is local is probably a slogan that applies in this case. And I think Macron in France set off a chain reaction that other leaders are latching onto. And again, it's out of a feeling that we need to do something. That's at least how they appear to be feeling it, and that if this government in Israel is so uninterested, if we're opposed to this government in Israel and we want to advance a two-state solution, then we must, if they're going to create facts on the ground, then we're going to try to create facts on the ground ourselves, except for one could argue that these are not actually creating facts on the ground, that these are largely symbolic recognitions that could maybe take us further away, given how Israel reacts to these recognitions. We'll have to see. But I think the argument of, well, we need to just save these recognitions for negotiations and not touch the issue until then, I think it's to a lot of these countries doesn't carry the same weight as it used to, because we're so far away from a potential negotiation that therefore we actually do think that if we believe in a two-state solution, that this is part of it, is this step of recognition. Again, the argument on the other hand is that it has to come, there's a sequencing to this that's important. But I think that these leaders are just feeling exasperated and beholden to their publics that are frustrated as well.
So how do you think these leaders feel or respond when they hear our Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, say, as he was quoted not long ago, talks with Hamas fell apart on the day Macron made the unilateral decision that he's going to recognize the Palestinian state. And we have other people come forward, other countries say, well, if there's not a ceasefire by September, we're going to recognize a Palestinian state. I'm continuing. If I'm Hamas, I'd basically conclude, let's not do a ceasefire because we can be rewarded. We can claim it as a victory. How do you think they hear that?
Yeah, I think just sequentially here, Rubio claims that this decision by France is what led Hamas to back out of negotiations. Hamas had submitted its response 24 hours before France made its recognition, and even went public with the terms of that response before Macron spoke. Is it possible they knew that Macron was going to be making this decision? Yes. But in terms of exact sequencing, I don't think Rubio was necessarily accurate there. But yes, what we have seen is that since those recognitions have started coming in, the talks have been at a standstill. And on the one hand, I speak with Arab mediators who are pretty adamant, mediators from both Egypt and Qatar, that are adamant that the talks, well, yes, Hamas did raise demands that would have made it more difficult to reach a deal after Israel did basically cede most of its demands that it initially made. That led to, I think, a stalemate for 2 weeks prior to that. But the talks, it was possible to reach an agreement that the gaps were bridgeable. But that there was this combination of US and Israeli decision-making to step away due to frustration, feeling that Hamas was just simply dragging Israel on the sides along, and that therefore it wasn't worth entertaining these new conditions that Hamas made. And that is why we're in the impasse that we're in. I think it's hard to argue that these decisions that countries are making are not emboldening Hamas to sit back. Um, and I think the demands that it's had, there was it seems like a period of about a month where they were willing to give up that demand for a permanent end to the war in exchange for releasing hostages, i.e. willing to do this partial deal. One could argue if that was military pressure, pressure from the mediators, I don't know, but there was a period. But besides that 1 month period, basically Hamas has said the same thing from the get-go. We're willing to end the war if you release, we're willing to give all the hostages if you end the war and withdraw from Gaza. Netanyahu has been adamant that that leaves Hamas in power and is demanding, in addition to that, that Hamas be disarmed, that Gaza be demilitarized. Then he adds different conditions depending on when he's speaking about Trump's plan to encourage the migration of Gazans outside of the Strip. That's also a condition that he's used. About there are a couple of exile of Hamas leaders, various conditions that depending on when he's speaking he'll raise, but those are his conditions for ending the war. And what's I think they made those conditions, I think when you're asking one side to completely capitulate basically and admit defeat, I think it's hard in those to hold negotiations in that matter. And as a result, I think we're kind of in the stalemate that we're in. But yes, I think there is an argument to be made that these recognitions do make it harder to negotiate.
We've been talking about spin, and we've been talking about how things are interpreted, and we've talked about, you've mentioned anti-Semitism as well. But one of our listeners said, well, can you really spin 60,000 Gazan deaths?
I mean, I think the answer is kind of in that question. Look, the argument that Israel will make is that if you look at the ratio of civilians to combatants, that actually this war is very low, on the low end of if you take the Israeli number, I think it's of 25,000 fighters that it has killed, that if it's basically I don't know, a 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratio of civilians to combatants, that's actually quite low. I think that is a point that John Spencer, for example, and I think other supporters of Israel will make. I don't think it's one that's very salient, at least in internet global public opinion. I think people, the photos of children in Gaza that are suffering, and I think are more driven by that. And that doesn't mean that that's right, that they're being driven, I think, more by emotion than just the pure facts and numbers. But I think, yes, it's a difficult campaign. Something just spin, not spin. These are difficult things to grapple with, and because war is so brutal. But the fact that it's just been going on for so long is what makes it also hard to justify.
I feel compelled to also say that Israel has taken much greater precautions to protect Gazan citizens than Hamas has to put them in harm's way. And that's just one of the ironies here that, again, is rarely, if ever, mentioned. And Hamas has as much as said, the more dead, the more innocents that die, the better for their war effort. I want to switch over now and talk a little bit about what's going on in Congress, because you're a person who's walked those halls, Congress people, you've been there, and it really feels like there is a sea change going on in Congress. And I'll just use one example. Mike Quigley, who's our representative, is on the permanent committee on intelligence. He's on as well as national security. So no one can accuse him of being uninformed. So when he gets up or he starts publishing things, not only about his horror and using that number of 60,000, right? And then he says since October 7th, I've consistently upheld Israel's right to defend itself and have repeatedly called on Hamas to immediately and unconditionally release the hostages. I reiterate this call." And then he goes on to say, I am calling for the United States to officially recognize a Palestinian state to ensure a peaceful future for the region as well as the safety and security of both Palestinians and Israelis." He goes on to say it can't be done in one stroke and all the rest. But gosh, when Mike Quigley and some of the starts writing this, it's just proof positive that there's something going on. And so you want to help us understand what you think is happening?
Yeah, I think the longer this war goes on, the more Israel's going to continue taking a hit in global public opinion, but also even losing its support from traditional allies, especially those who are more progressive. But I've written a little bit about also on the Republican side of the aisle. If you look at just the Democrat side, though, this vote on a resolution or a couple of resolutions that Bernie Sanders brought to the Senate floor a couple of weeks ago regarding trying to stop the transfer of weapons to Israel, a certain subset of weapons that were sent. And I think you had 27 Democrats voting in favor of one of Sanders's resolutions. So that's a majority of them. And they included people in that kind of camp that you maybe described for Mike Quigley, people like Tammy Duckworth in Illinois and Amy Klobuchar in Minnesota, people who are, yes, definitely more progressive and have been willing to criticize Israeli policy before, but have never gone and taken the step of actually voting for something like this to block military assistance to Israel. I think that's how it's a result of this war dragging on and feeling that there's no real plan that Israel has for how to end it. I think that's really the point. If I haven't been able to effectively explain where the frustration is coming from, I think it's really that there's this notion that we're almost at the end, but what Israel envisions for Gaza has not been clarified, and the vacuum that Netanyahu has created of what will come after has been filled by the extremists that he's sitting with, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, who are talking about basically voluntarily migrating all of Gazans out, which is, I think, just a euphemism for ethnic cleansing, especially when you destroy, and Netanyahu even said it himself in a private meeting of Likud lawmakers a few months ago, that we're destroying every house in Gaza. There's nowhere else for people to go back to besides outside of the strip. And so there's that movement on the one hand of just pushing Gazans out, and then the movement of the settlement, reestablishing settlements there, that you have, I think, over half or more of government ministers that have signed pledges, attended conferences that back this notion of reestablishing settlements in places where Palestinians once lived. And while Netanyahu will say these are not the policies of the government, the operations that they're advancing are making it easier for those policies to come into fruition. And I think these folks are the only ones giving an actual vision for what they want to see in Gaza after the war. And they're in government, as much as Netanyahu might not want to downplay them. That's the reality. And as a result of this vacuum being filled by these more hardline voices, I think you're seeing a real departure on the Democratic side and amongst other members of Israel's supporters abroad that are simply fed up the more this continues without a clear end game in sight.
And the actions of the Hilltop Youth and the territories is certainly not helping anyone in this conversation. A couple of questions from our audience. In your opinion, why won't Israel let reporters into Gaza?
Yeah, I think the argument that's used is that it's simply not safe, and that Hamas still has operatives there, that they will use reporters as either as human shields or simply, if Israel gets into a position where they are accidentally harming a journalist, they'll definitely be blamed. Or if a journalist is harmed, Israel will be blamed. And I think they want to probably avoid those scenarios. But again, I think at 22 months into the war, I think those arguments are less convincing to people. Um, if you watch Piers Morgan, I'm not someone who does, but he's quite popular, and this has been the point that he's been hammering on his show when he brings on Israeli officials to ask about what's happening in Gaza. He pounds on this question of, if you're going to tell us that Hamas's statistics are false, or if you're going to tell us that we can't believe what Hamas is saying in X, Y, or Z scenario, then you got to start allowing journalists in to at least be able to verify, because you can't have both at the same time. Netanyahu was actually asked about this issue at the press conference on Sunday, the English press conference, and he said that he had directed the IDF to start allowing more journalists in. But the issue is that what that basically just means is more journalists going into Gaza in military embeds, where the military just shows the journalists what they want to see, but doesn't allow them to actually report freely. And I think that doesn't really address the issue. And I think at this point, I think both sides would be well served, both sides, to have journalists in there. I think it allows Israel to, in situations like the Al Aliyah hospital bombing, where Israel was blamed right away, I think having journalists there, I think, can shed a lot of light. I get that part of the reason maybe is also that the really lack of trust that the Israeli government has in media, given, I feel, as we've talked about, there's this real feeling of bias against Israel, and that giving access to people who are going to inherently judge Israel negatively, maybe it won't suit Israel so well. But I think at this point in the war, I think it is something that would be beneficial for many reasons.
Thank you. Another question. Has Netanyahu said anything that would provide hope to the Gaza civilians? It's difficult to envision peace unless a reasonable future is presented.
I lost you. Has Netanyahu said anything? Oh, okay. Provide hope. Sorry. I think what he talks about is that if you defeat Hamas, that's what provides a hope for Palestinians in Gaza. That this is what they're begging us to do. I think he said this in the press conference, that this is what Palestinians want, is to be released from the chains of Hamas rule. And that very well might be true. I think the grass is always greener is what you see in these polls about what Palestinians prefer. I think the PA is incredibly unpopular in the West Bank, and you can see higher numbers of support for Hamas there. And in Gaza, it's the reverse. And having seen what Hamas rule is like, they realize that it's not something they want, especially after October 7th, and what Hamas's onslaught has brought upon Gazan civilians. And so Netanyahu has tried to argue that what we're trying to do is to the benefit of Gazans, but I think the way that this war has been prosecuted has come at the expense of Palestinian civilians, to the point where I think they no longer feel that that even if the end goal is to try to get Hamas, the way that Israel is carrying it out, due in no small part of Hamas's own strategy of trying to get as many civilian casualties as possible. I think I think more of the anger is at Israel at this point than at Hamas.
Yeah, that's all true. And I would just add that countries like Egypt have sort of played a role here in tacitly supporting the work of Hamas by closing their gates, by building higher walls to ensure that Gazans can't go to places like the Sinai, where we couldn't have spared more lives. But those arguments are never made and never stated, and it is striking.
I think, yeah, it's not something you hear so much from the Israeli government. I do hear it a little bit more from Israel supporters, that frustration with Egypt and other countries, that why aren't we allowing Gazans to leave? The counter to that you'll hear from, because I have asked Egyptian officials, I don't know how convincing it is, but this is just what they say, is that Israel never really guaranteed that, and even if they did, I think there's a question of whether they would have believed it, that those who leave can return. And when there's this talk of establishing settlements and talk of encouraging Palestinians to emigrate, I think these countries like Egypt didn't want to be put in a situation where they're kind of enabling this clearing of Gaza of Palestinians, I think they use that to their own political benefit, and I think it's easier to not have to play that role. But that was one of the arguments that I think was made, that this concern that that those who leave wouldn't be allowed to return. And I will note that there was a pilot program done where I think about 100 Palestinians were allowed to leave Gaza through, I guess, through the Rimon airport. So I guess through Israel, then they left Israel, and they went out to, I think, Indonesia, one of the countries in the Far East, for work. And those who participated in this pilot program had to sign a letter saying that they were willing to relinquish the possibility that they wouldn't be able to return to Gaza. So when those are the conditions, I think it makes some of these countries a bit more uneasy about complying.
Nice. Two more questions.
Yeah.
Do you have any hope that the Witkoff efforts will bear any fruit?
Yeah, it's a question like what even the Witkoff efforts are right now. He had been behind this effort to try to do another partial deal. He was very critical of the Biden framework, but then basically adopted it again, saying where you have 10 hostages come out, or some of them, and then you hold a negotiation, and then if you reach an agreement, then you'll get the rest of the hostages. Now it seems like Israel and the US are moving away from this partial dynamic and are only willing to negotiate a full hostage deal. I think it's going to be up to, like it was in January, it's going to be up to Trump really pushing, and the other mediators pushing the parties to just simply not take no for an answer and agree to a deal. If we do move towards a more comprehensive deal, unfortunately, it's going to take time to come together, because they haven't really been working on it until now. I think the Arab mediators, Egypt, Qatar, now I think Turkey's a little bit more involved, are working on this more comprehensive package now that it seems like Israel and the US don't want the partial deal, but that's going to have to be signed off by the US as well. And that's just going to take time to negotiate those details, and basically square this massive circle, I guess you could say, and about whether or not Hamas has to be disarmed, whether that can be part of a gradual process after the war, that's like what we're seeing in Lebanon, or if it's something that Israel's demanding up front, whether the PA is allowed to return to Gaza, because that unlocks a lot of the Arab support that Netanyahu wants, or if the PA is, as Israel is conditioning, is not allowed in, and then therefore you get no Arab support in Gaza, and you're basically Israel's on its own. So there are a lot of issues that need to be settled before you get to that comprehensive deal. I think it has to do less with Witkoff, to be honest. I think it's really more about, because I don't think he's very getting into the weeds on these issues and focusing on other deals to try to broker with Russia and other places as well. I think he's also involved in China. So I think if Trump at some point just simply decides that he's had enough, then maybe I think we could see a deal. But for now, the approach from the Trump administration is to allow Israel to fight this out. They feel that military pressure can be used to coax Hamas into agreeing to the terms that Israel would like to see.
Well, let's not forget Qatar's role here as well, that they do have power, since so many of the Hamas leaders are living in Qatar. One last question for you. What gives you hope?
Okay. What gives me hope? I think seeing the amount that people care about this issue, while I think it might not always be in the direction that I think is beneficial, I think the fact that people do care, I think does give reason for hope, and that maybe cooler heads can prevail. I do admit that right now I think it is hard to feel hopeful, but I think if you do think about, remember the fact that the majority of Israelis don't necessarily agree with the way that this war is being handled. that maybe I think from that grassroots level, something can sprout to change things. I think if you look at some of these organizations that have been operating throughout the war to kind of fill the gaps that the government hasn't been filling, whether it is to rebuild some of the communities that were destroyed on October 7th, organizations that are working to try to get aid into Gaza to try to help those who are suffering, the hostage families and the stories that of resilience that they're able to share. There was the wedding on last Thursday of Siegel, whose parents, Aviva and Keith, were abducted on October 7th, and Keith was held for over 400 days in Gaza. And I went through the pictures quite a few times. There's this video of what's his name? Sagid, who an American citizen, has also held, that was released in this January deal. And I encourage viewers to take a look at this YouTube video of him singing. There was a song, Al Tifki, Keren Shemesh. It was called Keren Shemesh. Incredibly moving rendition. It's the song he said he sang in captivity, and seeing him being able to sing it with his friends and with his family around him, that gives me immense hope, and that definitely moves me to continue doing the work that I do, to cover this conflict that can be really wrenching at times. But I think the hostage families, yeah, I think I was a little bit choppy getting into an answer here, but I think that's where I'll end, is I think those families give me hope, because they have no choice but to continue their efforts to try to get their loved ones out. And therefore, I think we should emulate them in many ways.
Well, Jacob, we are very appreciative of the time you've given us and the breadth of knowledge that you shared with us. We wish you well in your work, and we wish you chizuk, strength to go forward and juggle the many balls that you juggle. And God willing, we will be able to celebrate other hostages coming home to their families and other weddings, and that day should come soon. Just want to remind everyone that next Tuesday, a week from tomorrow, we'll be having the pleasure of focusing with Jonathan Schanzer, who is the head of a very important think tank. He's an expert on Gaza. He's also an expert on Iran, and we will be focusing our questions there. I thank you again, Jacob, and thank everybody for making time this evening. Good night, everyone. Lila Tov.